Now what the hell do you think you're doing with that tin star, boy?
Watch that boy shit, redneck. You talking to the sheriff of Rock Ridge.
Blazing Saddles has been picked apart for 50 years. Every line has been quoted, every joke analyzed, every controversy relitigated. And yet there's one thing about this movie that hides in plain sight, something so simple that most people watching it have never stopped to really think about it. It's not a hidden cameo. It's not a deleted scene. It's a choice. One actor's choice. And without it, the entire movie might have fallen apart. Let's start at the beginning, because the story of how Gene Wilder ended up in Blazing Saddles is almost as wild as anything that happens on screen. When Mel Brooks began shooting in 1973, the role of the Waco Kid, the washed-up, alcoholic gunslinger who becomes Sheriff Bart's only ally, wasn't written for Gene Wilder at all. The part went to Gig Young, a respected actor who'd won an Academy Award just a couple of years earlier for They Shoot Horses, Don't They? On paper, Young made sense. He had the gravitas, the weathered look, the pedigree. But almost immediately, things went wrong. Young arrived on set in rough shape, and what should have been a manageable first day of shooting turned into something much more serious. He was unwell, seriously unwell, to the point where production had to stop entirely. Brooks, suddenly without his Waco Kid and with a crew on the clock, had to make a decision fast. He called Gene Wilder. The two had worked together before, on The Producers, and Brooks trusted him completely. According to accounts from both men over the years, Wilder didn't hesitate. He didn't need a long pitch, didn't need to read pages of dialogue first, he just said yes and got on a plane. Within a day, he was on set, stepping into a role that had been built around someone else's energy entirely. Now here's where it gets interesting. Wilder didn't just show up and start performing the way the script might have suggested. He made a decision early on, one that, in hindsight, completely shaped the tone of the movie. He decided to play it straight. Think about that for a second. Blazing Saddles is, by design, a film built on chaos. It's loud. It's absurd. It breaks the fourth wall. Characters punch horses, sing musical numbers in the middle of the desert, and eventually spill out of the movie itself into a brawl on a studio backlit. Everything about the production was engineered to be as over-the-top as possible. And in the middle of all that noise, Wilder chose to be quiet. He played the Waco Kid not as a comic clown, but as a man who was tired. Hungover. Haunted. When Bart first meets him hanging upside down in a jail cell, half-conscious and mumbling, there's no broad mugging for the camera. There's no wink. Wilder delivers his lines with this flat, weary honesty, like a man who's said these things to himself 1,000 times before and stopped finding them funny a long time ago. That contrast is the whole joke. The Waco Kid isn't funny because he's trying to be funny. He's funny because everyone around him is insane, and he's the only person in the movie who seems to notice. Take the scene where Bart asks him how fast he used to be with a gun. The kid's response, about losing it all to a 6-year-old kid in a duel, isn't delivered as a punchline. It's delivered like a confession. There's real shame in it. Real regret. And because Wilder commits to that emotional truth instead of playing for laughs, the line lands harder than it would if he'd hammed it up. This is the thing fans tend to miss. They remember Blazing Saddles for the fart jokes, for the have you got the white woman gag, for the chaos of the final act. They don't always stop to notice that one of the most beloved characters in the film is doing something completely different from everyone else, and that difference is exactly why he works. Mel Brooks has talked about this over the years too. He's described Wilder's performance as the emotional anchor of the movie, the thing that kept the satire from tipping over into pure farce. When everything else in the frame is screaming for attention, having one character who refuses to scream creates a kind of gravity. It gives the audience somewhere to rest. And from that resting place, the absurdity around him becomes even funnier by comparison. There's also a layer to this that's easy to overlook. The Waco Kid is, underneath the jokes, a portrait of someone dealing with real trauma. He's an alcoholic. His hands shake. He talks about his past with a kind of detached numbness. In a film that's mostly interested in skewering racism, hypocrisy, and Hollywood itself, the Waco Kid is the one character whose comedy is rooted in something genuinely sad. Wilder seemed to understand that instinctively. He didn't play the kids drinking as a punchline about a funny drunk. He played it as a coping mechanism for a man who'd given up. And because he never overplayed that sadness, never turned it into a serious acting moment that broke the comedic rhythm, it just sits there, quietly, under everything else. You don't notice it consciously. But it's part of why the character feels like a real person instead of a cartoon, and that realness is part of why audiences have stayed attached to him for 50 years. Now, here's where the story gets even more interesting, because Wilder's contribution to Blazing Saddles didn't stop at his performance. Richard Pryor was one of the film's co-writers, and his fingerprints are all over the script, particularly the sharpest, most pointed jokes about race and power. Pryor had also been considered for the lead role of Sheriff Bart at one point, though that casting never came together, and Cleavon Little ultimately took the part. But Pryor's voice as a writer shaped the film's entire comedic backbone, and Wilder, working alongside that material, had to find a way to play a character who could exist inside that satire without either softening it or competing with it. That's a harder balancing act than it sounds. If the Waco Kid had been written, or played, as just another loud, broad character, the film's satirical edge might have gotten lost in the noise. Instead, Wilder's stillness gave the satire room to breathe. The jokes about racism and small-town ignorance hit harder because they're not competing with a dozen other characters all trying to be the funniest person in the scene. There's one more piece of this story that a lot of people don't realize, and it has nothing to do with Blazing Saddles directly, except that it does. During the production, in between takes, Wilder and Brooks started talking about another idea. Wilder had been thinking about a concept for a while. What if the grandson of the original Dr. Frankenstein wanted absolutely nothing to do with the family name? What if he spent his whole life trying to distance himself from his ancestors' legacy, only to get pulled back into it anyway? That conversation, happening in the downtime of one of the most chaotic film shoots in comedy history, became the seed for Young Frankenstein. Wilder didn't just act in that film later, he co-wrote it, and it became one of the most beloved comedies ever made, in large part because it carries the same DNA as his Waco Kid performance: restraint, emotional honesty, and a deep respect for the line between funny and sad. So when you put it all together, here's what most fans never really stop to think about: Gene Wilder's performance in Blazing Saddles wasn't just one good performance among many in a movie full of them. It was a structural choice that held the entire film together. By refusing to be the loudest thing on screen, he gave everyone else permission to be as loud as they wanted. By playing a broken man with genuine sadness instead of cartoonish exaggeration, he gave the film an emotional core that the satire could push against. And by stepping into a role that was never written for him, under genuinely difficult circumstances, he ended up defining how that character, and in some ways the whole movie, would be remembered. It's easy to watch Blazing Saddles and focus on the noise. The noise is what makes it famous. But the noise only works because of the quiet at the center of it. That's the thing Gene Wilder understood, the thing he brought to the role almost by instinct, and the thing that, decades later, still quietly holds the whole movie together, even if most people watching have never quite put their finger on why. The next time you watch the jailhouse scene, or the moment the kid talks about his trembling hands, pay attention to what Wilder isn't doing. He's not performing. He's not asking for the laugh. He's just there, present, honest, and somehow, that's funnier than almost anything else in the movie. That's the detail.